There is a photograph that sits in the quiet halls of the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. It is black and white, slightly faded at the edges, and it shows a boy no older than 6 standing on a backyard rink in Brantford, Ontario. The boy is impossibly small. His stick looks almost as tall as he is. His helmet swallows his head. His jersey hangs past his knees, so his grandmother has tucked the front hem into his pants to keep it from dragging on the ice. That tuck would become famous. Sports journalists would write about it decades later, with the kind of fondness usually reserved for creation myths. That boy would become the most dominant athlete his sport has ever known. His name was Wayne Douglas Gretzky, and by the time he was finished playing the game of hockey, there would be nothing left for anyone else to break. Picture a cold January night in Edmonton, Alberta. The year is 1984. The Northlands Coliseum is packed to the final seat. 18,000 people breathing the same sharp air, that unmistakable blend of arena cold and human warmth. The Edmonton Oilers are on the ice, and the crowd is standing because they have learned by now that when number 99 touches the puck, something extraordinary is about to happen. On this particular night, Wayne Gretzky will extend a consecutive game point streak that has already reached 45 games. 45 consecutive games without failing to register at least 1 point. It is the longest such streak in the history of the National Hockey League, and it would eventually reach 51 games before ending. 51 games. To appreciate the scale of that achievement, consider that the second longest point streak in NHL history belongs to Mario Lemieux at 46 games. Consider that most elite players go their entire careers without stringing together 20. Consider that in a sport defined by unpredictability, where a single bad bounce or a hot opposing goaltender can shut down even the greatest player on any given night, Wayne Gretzky produced at least 1 point in 51 straight games. He was 23 years old at the time. He had already won 4 scoring titles. He was only getting started. Consider for a moment what it means to be the greatest, not one of the greatest, not among the greatest, not in the conversation, the greatest. In most sports, the debate about who stands at the very top is an argument without resolution, a pleasant discussion that generates passion but no consensus. In basketball, there are compelling cases for several names. In baseball, the conversation stretches across more than 100 years. In football, quarterbacks from different decades are measured against each other with no agreement. But in hockey, there is no argument. There is no debate. There is Wayne Gretzky, and then there is everyone else. The gap between the two is not a crack in the pavement. It is a canyon so wide that you cannot see the other side. He holds or shares 61 official NHL records. 61. He scored more goals than any player in history, 894 in the regular season alone. He accumulated more assists than any player in history, 1,963 of them. And here is the fact that stops people cold every time they hear it. Even if you removed every single one of his goals, every last one, erased them from the record books as if they had never happened, his assist total alone would still make him the all-time leading point scorer in the history of professional hockey. His assists, just his assists, exceed the total points of the second highest scorer who ever played. That is not dominance. That is a different category of existence. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just what Wayne Gretzky did on the ice, but why it mattered so deeply, how it changed the very structure and geography of the sport, and what was lost when he finally stepped away. You are going to understand the boy from Brantford, who was scoring against children 5 and 6 years older than him before he had lost all of his baby teeth. You are going to understand the young man who carried an entire franchise, an entire league, and at times an entire country on his slender shoulders. You are going to understand the trade that broke a nation's heart, the records that may never be approached, the quiet cost of fame, and the slow, dignified farewell of a man who gave everything he had to the game and then watched as the game moved on without him. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. This is the story of Wayne Gretzky, the Great One, the player who rewrote every record in the book and then closed the book behind him so gently that the world barely heard it shut. Now, Let us begin. To understand what Wayne Gretzky meant to the game of hockey, you first have to understand what the center position was before he arrived, what it demanded, what it rewarded, and how narrow its possibilities seemed to every player, coach, and scout who had ever thought carefully about the position in the decades leading up to the late 1970s. Because Gretzky did not merely excel at playing center, he dismantled the very concept of what a center was supposed to be and rebuilt it in his own image, and the position has never been the same since. The center in ice hockey is the player who lines up in the middle of the forward line, positioned between two wingers, one on the left and one on the right. The center takes face-offs, those crucial moments at the beginning of each period, after each goal, and after each stoppage of play, when an official drops the puck between two opposing players and each one battles to direct it toward his own teammates. Winning face-offs is essential because it determines which team gains initial possession, and possession in hockey, as in most sports, is the foundation of offense. Beyond face-offs, the center is expected to be the most complete forward on his line, capable of skating in both directions with equal commitment, responsible for defensive coverage in the middle of the ice in a way that wingers often are not, and gifted enough offensively to create scoring chances for his line mates and finish them himself. The center is the quarterback of hockey, the player through whom the action flows, the pivot around which offensive structure is built and defensive responsibility is anchored. In the original Six era, the period from 1942 to 1967, when the National Hockey League consisted of only 6 teams, the great centers were defined by a combination of toughness, two-way responsibility, and a modest but effective offensive touch. The league was small and fiercely competitive. Every team played the other 5 dozens of times per season. Players knew each other's tendencies intimately, their strengths and weaknesses catalogued through years of repetition. There was no hiding. There was no novelty. Success required consistency, durability, and the mental fortitude to perform against the same opponents night after night without variation or relief. Players like Jean Beliveau of the Montreal Canadiens set a standard of graceful power that defined the era. Beliveau was a large man by the standards of his time, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds, dimensions that would be unremarkable today, but were imposing in an era when the average player was considerably smaller. He skated with an elegance that belied his size, moving through traffic with long, smooth strides that made the game look effortless. There was a majesty to his movement, a regal quality that earned him the nickname Le Gros Bill. He commanded respect, not through intimidation, but through the sheer quality of his play and the dignity of his bearing. He won 10 Stanley Cup championships as a player, captained the Canadiens with quiet authority, and accumulated 1,219 career points across 20 seasons. Beliveau was the model of what a center should be. Physically imposing, offensively productive, defensively responsible, and temperamentally suited to the weight of leadership. He carried himself with a composure that transcended the rink, becoming one of the most respected figures in Canadian public life. Milt Schmidt of the Boston Bruins offered a slightly different template for the position. Schmidt was tough, combative, and willing to absorb punishment that would have broken lesser men. He played through the 1940s and early 50s in an era when the game was brutally physical, when boards were unforgiving wooden barriers without any cushioning, when equipment offered minimal protection against sticks and elbows and fists, and when violence was not merely tolerated but celebrated as an essential element of the sport. The culture of hockey in that era was built on a code of toughness that demanded players continue through injuries that would sideline athletes in other sports. Schmidt embodied that code. He led the league in scoring, won the Hart Trophy as most valuable player, and later coached and managed the Bruins. His style was built on effort and courage rather than finesse. He outworked opponents. He outfought them. He imposed his will through sheer determination, grinding through games with a relentlessness that wore down anyone who tried to match him. Kyle Apps of the Toronto Maple Leafs represented yet another variation on the center position during this formative era. Apps was a remarkable all-around athlete who had competed in the 1936 Olympics as a pole vaulter before turning to professional hockey. That athletic background gave him a physical coordination and body control that set him apart from his peers. He was graceful, skilled, and possessed a sportsmanship so consistent that he won the Lady Byng Trophy, the award given to the player who combines the highest degree of skill with gentlemanly conduct. Apps played the centre position with discipline and restraint. He was productive offensively, but never at the expense of his defensive responsibilities. He understood that the centre position demanded sacrifice, that there were moments when the team needed him to back-check rather than chase a scoring chance, and he made that sacrifice willingly and without complaint. He was the kind of player that coaches pointed to when they wanted to show young centres what the position demanded: balance, completeness, and an unwillingness to sacrifice one aspect of the game for another. These players, and others like them, illustrate the range of what the centre position encompassed during the original six era. Some centres were elegant, some were tough, some were disciplined, but all shared a common trait: they were defined by what they could do across the full spectrum of the game, not by any single extraordinary ability. The centre was a workhorse position. It rewarded versatility over specialization, effort over artistry, and completeness over brilliance. No one expected a centre to be transcendent. They expected him to be reliable. The style of play reinforced this vision of the position and its demands. The game was slower than it would become in later decades, not because the players lacked talent or competitive fire, but because the tactical systems emphasized control, caution, and structure above all else. Coaches deployed their lines in rigid formations that prioritized defensive positioning over offensive creativity. The neutral zone was a gauntlet to be navigated carefully, not an open space to be exploited through speed. Forechecking was done with brute force rather than coordinated speed. Teams dumped the puck into the offensive zone and chased it, relying on physical pressure to recover possession rather than skilled stick handling to carry it across the blue line. Back-checking was expected of every forward, but the centre bore the heaviest burden. He was the first man back on defense, the player who had to read the developing play and position himself to break up the rush before it could generate a quality scoring chance. Offense was a welcome addition to a centre's skill set, but defense was identity. A centre who scored but did not back-check was a liability. A centre who back-checked but did not score was valuable. Through the 1950s and into the 60s, great centres continued to emerge within this framework without fundamentally altering it. Henry Richard of Montreal, the younger brother of the legendary Maurice Richard, won 11 Stanley Cup championships across a career stretching from 1955 to 1975. He was small and fast, compensating for his lack of size with quickness and an unshakable competitive spirit that he had inherited from his famous brother. Dave Keon of the Maple Leafs was perhaps the finest two-way centre of his generation, winning the Conn Smythe Trophy as most valuable player of the playoffs, not with scoring, but with defensive mastery so thorough that opposing teams simply could not generate offense when he was on the ice. Keon demonstrated that a centre could be the most important player in a playoff series without scoring a hat trick or making a highlight reel play. His value was measured in what he prevented rather than what he produced. Stan Mikita of the Chicago Blackhawks underwent a remarkable transformation that showed the position's possibilities without breaking its boundaries. Early in his career, Mikita was a rough, penalized enforcer who spent as much time in the penalty box as on the ice. Then, influenced by his daughter's innocent question about why he sat alone so often during games, he reformed his style entirely. He became a disciplined, creative playmaker, winning the Hart Trophy, Art Ross Trophy, and Lady Byng Trophy in the same season twice, a feat no one else has accomplished. Mikita showed that a centre could be the league's best through skill rather than force, but even his evolution occurred within the boundaries of the existing position. He was still a two-way centre. He still back-checked. He still fought for pucks in the corners with tenacity. His evolution was one of degree, not of kind. The template remained intact. Then came the expansion era, and the ground began to shift. In 1967, the NHL doubled from 6 teams to 12, adding franchises in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Minnesota, and Oakland. The league continued to grow throughout the 70s, eventually reaching 18 teams. The expansion brought new markets, new audiences, and new styles of play that reflected the broader, more diverse talent pool. It also exposed a tension that had always existed beneath the surface of professional hockey. The sport rewarded creativity and imagination, but the culture had long prioritized toughness, conformity, and adherence to established patterns over those qualities. Players who deviated from convention were viewed with suspicion, even when their deviations produced results. The arrival of Bobby Orr cracked open the door that convention had kept sealed for decades. Orr was a defenseman, not a center, but his impact was so profound and so visible that it reshaped expectations across every position on the ice. Before Orr, defensemen stayed back. They made safe-keep plays. They cleared the puck out of the defensive zone with simple chips off the glass. They did not carry the puck end-to-end. They did not lead rushes. They did not score goals with regularity. Bobby Orr did all of these things with a breathtaking speed and fluidity that seemed to belong to a different sport entirely. He won the Norris Trophy as best defenseman 8 consecutive times. He won the scoring title twice, a feat no defenseman has matched before or since. He won the Hart Trophy 3 times. He demonstrated, with an eloquence that required no words, that convention could be shattered by individual genius, and that the wreckage could be beautiful. Orr's impact on the forward position was indirect but significant. If a defenseman could redefine his position through individual brilliance, what might be possible for a forward? The question hung in the air throughout the 70s, unanswered but impossible to ignore. In the forward ranks, Phil Esposito of the Bruins became the first player to score 76 goals in a season, a number that seemed incomprehensible at the time. Esposito was large and physical. He planted himself in front of the opposing net like an oak tree and refused to be moved, absorbing cross-checks and slashes and hooks, while deflecting shots and pouncing on rebounds with a predatory instinct. His dominance was built on positioning and stubbornness, rather than creativity or vision. He found a spot on the ice where goals could be scored, and he occupied it with an immovable determination that drove opposing defensemen to frustration and despair. Bobby Clarke of the Philadelphia Flyers led the Broad Street Bullies to 2 Stanley Cups in 1974 and 1975 through ferocious competitiveness and relentless effort, winning 3 Hart Trophies along the way. Clarke was the embodiment of the traditional center taken to its absolute extreme. He forechecked with savage intensity. He backchecked with equal commitment. He won face-offs through sheer will. He ground opponents down over the course of a game and a series, wearing them out physically and mentally until they had nothing left. Clarke executed the existing template for the center position with maximum intensity, pushing it as far as it could go, but he did not fundamentally change the template. He was the ultimate expression of what the position had always been, not a preview of what it might become. The Summit Series of 1972 also shaped the evolving understanding of hockey and the center position in particular. The 8-game confrontation between Canada and the Soviet Union revealed a completely different philosophy of the sport. Soviet forwards like Valery Kharlamov and Vladimir Petrov moved the puck with precision and patience, using possession, passing, and constant motion, rather than the dump-and-chase physicality of the Canadian game. The Soviet system was built on interconnected movement, with all 5 skaters flowing in coordinated patterns that created and exploited open ice. They wove through the neutral zone in intricate designs, exchanging short passes at full speed, creating scoring chances through collective intelligence rather than individual force. Canada won the series barely, on Paul Henderson's legendary goal with 34 seconds remaining in the final game, but the experience was humbling. It forced the hockey world to acknowledge that skill, creativity, and intelligence could be as valuable as size and toughness, and that the Canadian way was not the only way to play the game. By the late 1970s, the center position stood at a crossroads. The traditional model demanded a big, strong, defensively responsible player who could win face-offs, finish checks, and contribute modestly to the offense. The emerging model, influenced by European hockey, the offensive explosion of the expansion era, Bobby Orr's revolutionary example from the blue line and a growing appreciation for skill and speed suggested something more was possible. But no one had yet combined all these elements into a single, coherent, overwhelming vision of what the position could become. No one had shown that a center could simultaneously be the most creative, most prolific, most generous, and most intelligent player on the ice, and that those qualities could matter more than any physical attribute previously considered essential to the position. That someone arrived in the fall of 1979. He was 18 years old, barely 170 pounds soaking wet, and he had spent the previous season in the World Hockey Association, a rival league considered inferior to the NHL. The scouting reports were cautious at best and dismissive at worst. Too thin, not fast enough, could not shoot hard enough. His wrists were too narrow, his stride was too choppy. He would be overwhelmed by the NHL's bigger, stronger, more experienced players. The conventional wisdom was nearly unanimous in its verdict. Wayne Gretzky was talented but physically unsuited for the highest level of professional hockey. The conventional wisdom was catastrophically wrong. What Gretzky did to the center position was not an evolution. It was a revolution so complete that the position before and after his arrival might as well be different roles entirely. He did not play the position the way it had been taught in every youth program and junior league across the country. He played it the way it had never been imagined. Traditional centers planted themselves in front of the opposing net or battled along the boards in the corners, grinding for puck possession through physical effort. Gretzky stationed himself behind the opposing net, in an area of the ice that came to be known simply as his office. No one had used that space before, not systematically, not as a primary operating position. From behind the net, Gretzky could see the entire ice surface opening up before him. He could watch defenders commit to one side and slip the puck to a teammate cutting the other way. He could hold the puck for an extra heartbeat, an extra half second, that felt like an eternity to defenders trying to anticipate his next move, waiting for a passing lane that only he could see, and deliver a pass so precise and so perfectly timed that it arrived on a teammate's stick as if placed there by an invisible hand. His vision was superhuman. The word is not used casually. He processed the movement of all 10 skaters on the ice simultaneously, calculated where each would be a full second or two into the future based on their speed, angle, and tendencies, and made decisions based on that prediction, rather than on what was happening in the present moment. Coaches called it seeing the game in a different dimension. Scientists who later studied his cognitive processes concluded that his ability to process spatial information and predict movement was genuinely exceptional, comparable to chess grandmasters in the speed and depth of pattern recognition. His father had taught him to skate not to where the puck is, but to where the puck is going to be. That simple instruction became the foundation of a playing style that has never been replicated, despite decades of effort, by players who studied his every move. The numbers from his first seasons in the NHL were staggering, even by the standards of a high-scoring era. In his first NHL year, 1979-80, he tied for the scoring lead with 137 points. He won the Hart Trophy as Most Valuable Player at 19 years old. The next season, he scored 164 points, smashing the previous record. Then came 1981-82, the season that defied comprehension. 92 goals, 120 assists, 212 points. He was the first and remains the only player ever to reach 200 points in a single NHL season. He surpassed 203 more times in subsequent seasons. No one else has done it once. When he scored 215 points in the 1985-86 season, the gap between Gretzky in first place and the player in second place was 74 points. The gap between second place and 20th place was smaller than the gap between first and second. He was not playing a different version of the same game. He was playing a different game entirely. His impact went beyond statistics, as remarkable as those statistics were. He changed how teams were constructed, how offensive and defensive systems were designed, how the sport was coached at every level from youth leagues to the professional ranks. Before Gretzky, offensive systems were relatively simple and direct. After Gretzky, the concept of the playmaking center the creative hub through whom all offense flowed, became central to every team's strategic identity. Coaches redesigned their systems to accommodate players who could see and create in the way Gretzky had demonstrated was possible. He changed the economics of the sport as well. His presence turned the Edmonton Oilers into one of the most exciting and commercially successful teams in all of professional sports. His later trade to Los Angeles transformed the geography of hockey on the entire North American continent. The direct line between that single transaction and the NHL's eventual expansion to 32 teams spanning from coast to coast is acknowledged by virtually every historian of the sport. What made this transformation all the more remarkable was its instrument. Gretzky was not a physical marvel. He was slight, with an unorthodox skating stride that coaches would have tried to correct in a youth player. He was not the fastest skater on any team he played for. He did not possess the hardest shot. He was not physically imposing or intimidating. What he possessed was a mind for the game that transcended every physical limitation. A brain that processed hockey at a speed and depth no one before or since has matched. The center position before Gretzky was about doing everything well. After Gretzky, it was about the possibility of doing one thing, the intellectual mastery of the game, so extraordinarily well that it elevated everything else around it. This is the foundation on which the story of Wayne Gretzky is built. He took a position defined by balance and workmanlike completeness and redefined it through pure, undeniable brilliance. The game has never been the same since, and it never will be again. Consider the specific nature of this revolution for a moment longer, because its implications deserve full examination. Before Gretzky, the hockey world evaluated centers the way a construction foreman evaluates workers. Can he carry his share of the load? Can he dig in the corners? Can he win the physical battles that determine possession? Can he backcheck with the urgency the position demands? Gretzky rendered those questions secondary. Not irrelevant, but secondary, subordinate to a question no one had thought to ask. Can he think so far ahead of the play that physical superiority becomes meaningless? The answer, delivered across 20 professional seasons, was an emphatic yes, and the implications rippled outward in every direction. Youth coaches began identifying and nurturing creative players who would previously have been steered toward the wing or dismissed as too small. European players, whose game had always emphasized skill and vision over size and toughness, found wider acceptance in the NHL because Gretzky had proven that their style could not only survive but dominate. The power forward model, the big center who wins through physical imposition, did not disappear, but it lost its monopoly on the position. A new archetype had been created, the cerebral playmaker, and it would reshape the sport for generations. The statistical evidence of Gretzky's revolution is overwhelming and worth dwelling upon, because numbers of this magnitude deserve contemplation. He won the Hart Trophy as Most Valuable Player 9 times. He won the Art Ross Trophy as leading scorer 10 times. He recorded over 100 assists in a single season 11 times. No other player has done it once. He scored 50 goals in 39 games, reaching the 50-goal milestone faster than anyone in history. He holds the record for most goals in a season with 92, most assists in a season with 163, and most points in a season with 215. Each of these records stands alone as an extraordinary achievement. Together, they constitute a body of work that is less a career than a permanent redefinition of what is humanly possible within the structure of a team sport. The center position before Gretzky was a job description. After Gretzky, it was an aspiration, and the distance between the two remains the single greatest testament to the transformative power of individual genius in the history of professional team sports. What Gretzky understood, instinctively and completely, was that hockey is not a sport of straight lines and brute force, but a sport of angles, timing, and spatial relationships. Every pass he made was calculated not just in terms of distance and direction, but in terms of when the receiving player would arrive at the destination and at what speed and from what angle he would need to receive the puck to maintain his momentum and his scoring opportunity. The passes were not thrown to a spot on the ice. They were threaded through corridors of time and space that existed for fractions of a second before closing. The fact that his teammates caught these passes and scored from them with such regularity speaks not only to Gretzky's accuracy, but to the depth of his understanding of how each teammate moved, how each processed the game, how each preferred to receive the puck, and what each could do with it once it arrived on his stick. This was not merely skill. This was a comprehensive, three-dimensional understanding of a sport's deepest structural possibilities, applied in real time under competitive pressure, night after night, for 20 years. That is the foundation. That is the scale. And now the story can truly begin. The game before Gretzky was played within boundaries that everyone assumed were permanent. The best centres were measured against other centres who had come before, using criteria that had been established decades earlier and had never been seriously challenged. Speed, strength, face-off ability, defensive responsibility, physical courage, these were the virtues. These were the measurements. And then a thin teenager from southwestern Ontario arrived and demonstrated that every measurement was incomplete, that the most important quality a centre could possess had never been measured at all, because no one had imagined it could exist at the level he would demonstrate. The quality was vision, not eyesight, vision. The ability to see the game not as a series of isolated moments, but as a flowing, interconnected, endlessly evolving system of patterns and possibilities, and to exploit those patterns with a precision that left opponents, teammates, coaches, and spectators equally astonished night after night, year after year, decade after decade. Wayne Douglas Gretzky was born on January 26, 1961, in Brantford, Ontario, a small industrial city about an hour southwest of Toronto. The city was known for its manufacturing plants and modest residential neighborhoods, a place where families lived within their means and children understood early that comfort was earned through labor rather than inherited through privilege. The streets were lined with sturdy houses built for function rather than beauty, homes with small yards and chain-link fences, homes where working people raised families on wages that did not leave much room for extravagance. Brantford was not glamorous, it was not wealthy, it was the kind of Canadian city where hockey was not merely a sport but a language, a shared vocabulary of frozen ponds and Saturday night broadcasts and fathers teaching sons to skate on whatever patch of ice could be found or made. Wayne was the eldest of 5 children born to Walter and Phyllis Gretzky. Walter worked for Bell Canada as a telephone repairman, a steady union job that provided stability but not abundance. He drove the streets of Brantford and the surrounding countryside, climbing poles and splicing wires, working outdoors in the bitter Ontario winters with the same uncomplaining endurance that defined his generation of Canadian men. Phyllis managed the household with the quiet efficiency that raising 5 children demanded. She kept the home running, managed the finances, handled the logistics of a family that would soon be consumed by the demands of competitive hockey. The Gretzkys were solidly working class. They did not have wealth or connections or the kind of social standing that opens doors in the world of organized sports. What they had was a backyard, a garden hose, and a father who understood hockey at a level that went far beyond casual enthusiasm. Walter Gretzky had been a decent hockey player in his youth, talented enough to draw attention from junior scouts, but never quite talented enough to make the leap to professional hockey. The disappointment of that unfulfilled promise never became bitterness. Instead, Walter channeled his love of the game and his deep, almost scholarly understanding of its mechanics into the next generation. From the moment Wayne could stand on skates, Walter saw something in his eldest son that he could not fully articulate but recognized with absolute certainty. He never described it grandly or dramatically. He was not a man given to grand statements. He simply noted with quiet wonderment that his eldest son took to the ice with a naturalness that went beyond normal coordination, beyond the typical wobbling confidence of a toddler on blades. Wayne was on skates at 2 years old. By 3, he was moving with a confidence and fluidity that startled adults who watched him. By 4, Walter had begun the project that would become legendary in Canadian sporting mythology, the backyard rink. Each winter, when temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there, Walter would flood the backyard with the garden hose, building up ice layer by careful layer, over the course of several nights. The process was painstaking. Too much water at once, and the ice would be uneven, riddled with bumps and ridges. Too little, and it would be thin and brittle. Walter learned through trial and error how to build a surface that was smooth enough for skating, durable enough to withstand hours of daily use, and large enough to allow meaningful practice. The rink was not regulation size. It was not perfectly smooth. It was not equipped with boards or glass or goal creases painted in regulation dimensions, but it served its purpose perfectly. Wayne skated on it for hours every day, before school in the pale winter morning light, after school until the sky turned dark, weekends from dawn until his mother called him inside, holidays, snow days. Every day that the ice would hold, Wayne Gretzky was on it. The rink was his classroom, his laboratory, his sanctuary, and his obsession. Walter's training methods were remarkable for both their intelligence and their restraint. He did not push Wayne through punishing physical drills designed to build strength or endurance. He did not shout or berate or demand perfection through intimidation, methods that were common among hockey parents then and remain common now. Instead, Walter taught through repetition and creative problem solving, using simple tools to develop complex skills. He set up pylons on the backyard ice and had Wayne skate figure eights around them until the patterns became instinct, until Wayne's edges were so sharp and his turns so fluid that he could navigate the pylons at full speed without conscious thought. He placed obstacles on the ice and challenged Wayne to stick handle around and through them, while keeping his head up, never looking down at the puck. This last detail was crucial and reveals the depth of Walter's understanding of the game. Most young hockey players watch the puck. They look down at it constantly, their awareness limited to the small circle of ice directly in front of their stick. This is natural and instinctive. The puck is small and moves unpredictably, and the impulse to watch it is powerful. But a player who watches the puck cannot see the ice. He cannot read the positions of teammates and opponents. He cannot anticipate the flow of play. He is reacting to what has already happened, rather than preparing for what is about to happen. Walter understood this distinction with the clarity of a man who had spent years studying the game from the outside, watching it not as a participant caught up in the emotion of competition, but as an analyst dissecting its mechanical and strategic components. He made Wayne practice stick handling without looking at the puck until the skill became unconscious. Until Wayne could feel the puck on his stick, the way a musician feels the keys of a piano, through touch and muscle memory rather than sight. The famous instruction was deceptively simple, a sentence that would become the most quoted piece of coaching advice in the history of the sport. Skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been. Walter would sit with Wayne in the living room, watching Hockey Night in Canada, the weekly broadcast that served as a national ritual for millions of Canadian families, and have him trace the puck's movement on paper. He would draw the rink and chart the path of the puck across periods and shifts, marking where it went and where the open ice appeared. Over time, the tracings revealed patterns. Open ice appeared in the same places with predictable regularity. Certain defensive formations created the same gaps. Certain offensive strategies opened the same passing lanes. Walter would point to those spaces on the paper and ask Wayne what he noticed. The lesson was anticipation, seeing the game not as a series of disconnected reactions to unpredictable events, but as a flow of probabilities that could be predicted, mapped, and exploited by a player with the intelligence and discipline to study them. By age 6, the training had produced visible results that astonished everyone who witnessed them. Wayne was placed on the Brantford Nadrowski Steelers, a novice-level team composed of boys who were 10 and 11 years old. Wayne was the youngest player by 4 and 5 years, a tiny figure among children who towered over him, who outweighed him by 30 and 40 pounds, who had been playing organised hockey for years longer than he had. His first season was modest by any standard, 1 goal. The size disadvantage was simply too great for a 6-year-old to overcome entirely, no matter how gifted. But Walter kept teaching, and Wayne kept skating, and the improvement was not gradual but exponential. The next year, 27 goals, then 67, then 104, then 196. By age 10, in the 1970-71 season, Wayne Gretzky scored 378 goals and added 120 assists in a single season of youth hockey. The number seems like a misprint. It seems impossible. It was documented, reported, confirmed, and covered by local and then national media. 378 goals. By 10 years old, Wayne Gretzky was a national celebrity in Canada, featured in newspapers and on television broadcasts that normally covered professional athletes, not children. The fame came with a cost that would leave permanent marks on Wayne's character and his understanding of the world. In Brantford, the other parents resented the attention their community's prodigy received. They resented the newspaper articles. They resented the television cameras that showed up to film a 10-year-old playing against boys his own age and older. They resented what they perceived as Walter's self-promotion, as though a father's pride in his son's extraordinary accomplishments was somehow unseemly or manipulative. The resentment became toxic in ways that are difficult to comprehend from a distance. Parents jeered Wayne from the stands during games. Not the opposing team's parents, his own community. Adults in the bleachers of small-town arenas shouted insults at a child who was too young to fully understand the depth of their cruelty. Some confronted Walter directly, accusing him of pushing his son too hard, of exploiting him, of ruining the experience for other children. Some pulled their sons from teams rather than have them play alongside Wayne, as though his presence was a contamination rather than an inspiration. The hostility followed the family beyond the rink. It pursued them to school, to church, to the grocery store, to the small daily interactions that compose the social fabric of a small town. The Gretzkys became isolated in their own community, ostracized because their eldest son was too talented for the small-town sensibilities of Brantford to absorb without resentment. Wayne lost friendships. He was excluded from parties and social gatherings. He learned, at an age when most children are concerned with nothing more complex than playground politics, that being exceptional does not earn love. It earns jealousy. And jealousy, when it festers in the hearts of adults and is directed at a child, is one of the ugliest forces in human experience, and it gets harder, because the cruelty was not a single incident that could be processed and forgotten. It was sustained, week after week, month after month, year after year, inflicted by adults who should have known better on a boy who had done nothing wrong except be exceptional at something. The psychological toll on a child subjected to that kind of sustained hostility from his own community is difficult to overstate. Years later, as a retired adult reflecting on a career that had brought him every award and accolade the sport could offer, Wayne would describe the Brantford experience with quiet, measured sadness. He did not speak of it with anger or bitterness, though he would have been entitled to both. He acknowledged that being exceptional had made him a target and that the wounds inflicted during those years never fully healed. The experience shaped him profoundly and permanently. It taught him early, too early, that success does not protect you from the worst impulses of the people around you. It taught him to be cautious with his emotions, to present a calm, controlled, diplomatic surface to the world, to keep his inner life private and guarded. These traits, born of childhood pain, inflicted by adults who should have protected him, would define his public personality for the rest of his life. At 14, Wayne left Brantford for Toronto, moving in with a host family far from his parents and siblings. The separation was wrenching for a family as close-knit as the Gretzkys. Wayne was still a boy, still young enough to need his mother's comfort and his father's guidance, and the distance was painful for everyone. But it was necessary. It removed Wayne from the poisonous atmosphere of Brantford and placed him in an environment where his talent could develop without the constant weight of jealousy and resentment pressing down on him. He played for the Toronto Young Nationals and then the Vaughan Nationals, continuing to produce numbers that defied explanation. By 16, he was playing Major Junior A hockey for the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, competing against young men 3 and 4 years older than him and dominating them with a style that combined creativity, vision, and competitive intelligence in proportions no one had seen before. The doubts persisted despite the production. Wayne did not look like a hockey player, as the hockey world understood the term. He was thin, almost fragile-looking, with narrow wrists and an unorthodox skating stride. that bent convention in ways that made traditionalists uncomfortable. His shot was adequate, but not powerful. In a sport that prized size, strength, and physical intimidation above all other qualities, he appeared to be missing all three. The scouting consensus, that collection of professional opinions, that determines which young men will be given the chance to play at the highest level, was that Wayne Gretzky was gifted but physically unsuited for professional hockey. Too small, too slow, too frail, the NHL would eat him alive. He never entered the 1979 NHL draft. The complicated legal arrangement that governed his rights prevented it. At 17, he had signed a personal services contract with the Indianapolis Racers of the World Hockey Association. After just 8 games, the financially struggling Racers sold his contract to the Edmonton Oilers for cash that the franchise desperately needed. When the WHA folded and merged with the NHL in the summer of 1979, the Oilers entered the National Hockey League with Wayne Gretzky already on their roster. He was 18 years old. The skeptics were loud and numerous and confident, too small, too slow, too frail, would be pushed around and intimidated by bigger, stronger, more experienced players who would not be impressed by youth hockey statistics. But the skeptics were measuring the wrong things. They were evaluating Gretzky with tools designed to measure qualities that had defined previous centers. And Gretzky was not a previous center. He was something entirely new. From his first NHL game, the difference was apparent to anyone willing to see it. He processed the game at a speed no one on the ice could match. He saw passing lanes that did not yet exist and delivered the puck to precisely where the lane would open a heartbeat later. He was never where defenses expected him to be. He drifted into open space with a quiet, almost casual movement that disguised the extraordinary cognitive processing happening behind his eyes. He beat defenders not with speed or power or brute force, but with timing, deception, and an understanding of where everyone on the ice was about to go that bordered on the clairvoyant. In his first season, he tied Marcel Dion for the scoring lead with 137 points. He won the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player. He was 19 years old. The next season he scored 164 points, shattering the previous record. Then came 1981-82, 92 goals and 120 assists for 212 points. The skeptics fell silent, one by one, and then all at once. The Edmonton Oilers became one of the greatest dynasties in the history of professional team sports, built around Gretzky's genius and populated by players who complemented his gifts with their own considerable talents. Marc Messier provided physical presence, vocal leadership, and an intensity in crucial moments that few athletes in any sport have matched. Jari Kurri, a Finnish winger of extraordinary skill, developed a telepathic understanding with Gretzky, finishing his passes with devastating efficiency and positional intelligence. Paul Coffey brought breathtaking skating ability from the defense position, joining the rush with a speed and fluidity that recalled Bobby Orr. Glenn Anderson contributed fearless attacking instincts and a willingness to take creative risks that fit perfectly within the Oilers' system. Grant Fuhr provided spectacular athletic goaltending that allowed the Oilers to play their wide-open offensive style without being punished on the defensive end. The roster was deep, talented, and perfectly assembled, but everything, every system, every strategy, every game plan was built around number 99. They won the Stanley Cup for the first time in 1984, defeating the dynasty New York Islanders, who had won 4 consecutive championships. The victory was a passing of the torch, a symbolic transfer of power from one era of hockey to another. They won again in 85, demolishing the Philadelphia Flyers in a dominant performance. Again in 87, overcoming a grueling path through the playoffs. Again in 88, sweeping the Boston Bruins in 4 games. 4 Stanley Cup championships in 5 years. The Oilers played the most exciting, creative, breathtaking, entertaining hockey the sport had ever witnessed. They turned the game into art, a nightly display of speed, skill, and imagination that drew fans who had never cared about hockey before. And Gretzky was the artist at the center of every canvas. Then the story darkened. The 1988 championship should have been the beginning of an even greater run. Gretzky was 27, the prime of his career. The The core of the team was young and intact. Multiple additional championships seemed not just possible, but probable. What happened next was the most traumatic event in Canadian sports history. On August 9, 1988, Wayne Gretzky was traded to the Los Angeles Kings. The trade was a cultural earthquake whose aftershocks are still felt decades later. In Canada, the news was received with genuine grief and disbelief. Emotional reactions, normally reserved for national tragedies of a magnitude far beyond sports. The Prime Minister of Canada commented publicly. Newspaper headlines across the country screamed betrayal in typefaces normally saved for declarations of war. Gretzky held a press conference at which he broke down in tears, his voice cracking and then failing entirely, unable to finish his prepared remarks. The image of the greatest hockey player in history weeping as he was sent away from the franchise he had built, the city he had transformed from an oil industry outpost into an internationally recognized sporting capital, and the teammates he loved with the deep bond that comes only from winning championships together, became one of the most heartbreaking images in Canadian sporting history. The photograph of Gretzky crying at the podium is burned into the collective memory of a generation of Canadians. The reasons for the trade were complex and remain debated. Peter Pocklington, the Oilers owner, was facing financial pressures and needed the cash and players that Los Angeles was offering. Gretzky's wife, the actress Janet Jones, was based in Los Angeles, and rumors persisted that Gretzky himself had wanted the move, though he has consistently denied this. Pocklington initially blamed Gretzky publicly, claiming it was Wayne's desire to leave, a version of events that Gretzky rejected with uncharacteristic firmness. The full truth of who wanted what and who decided what remains debated by historians and journalists decades later, a rashomon of competing narratives that may never be fully resolved. What is beyond debate is the impact. Edmonton lost its identity, Canada felt it had lost a son, and the National Hockey League gained a transcendent superstar in the largest media market in North America. A development that would reshape the sport's geography, economics, and cultural footprint in ways that no one fully anticipated at the time. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The trade did not merely move a player from one roster to another. It tore apart the emotional fabric connecting a city, a franchise, a team, and a nation to the individual who had come to represent all of them simultaneously. Wayne Gretzky was not just a hockey player being relocated for business reasons. He was the embodiment of everything Edmonton and Canada believed about themselves. That talent, hard work, and community could produce something extraordinary, something that did not need a large market or corporate machinery or Hollywood glitz to thrive. The trade felt like a repudiation of those values. It felt like a statement that even the greatest talent in the world could be reduced to a line item on a balance sheet, sold to the highest bidder when the owner needed cash. The grief was real. The anger was real. The sense of betrayal, directed at Pocklington and whispered about Gretzky himself despite his tears, was real and lasting. For Wayne, the trade represented a fracture in the life he had built. He had arrived in Edmonton as an 18-year-old boy, uncertain of his place in the professional game. Over 9 seasons, he had grown into a man, a husband, a champion, and the most decorated player in the history of the sport. He had developed relationships with teammates that went beyond professional courtesy into the territory of brotherhood. He had learned to love a city that loved him back with an intensity that bordered on worship. He had built something extraordinary, and now it was being disassembled, not because it had failed, but because its owner could not afford to maintain it. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone. The greatest team in hockey history was being broken apart, not by a better opponent but by economics. The trade package was enormous. Los Angeles sent Jimmy Carson, Martin Gelinas, 3 first-round draft picks, and $15 million in cash to Edmonton. The value of the return reflected the magnitude of what was being given up. But no combination of players, picks, and cash could replace what Edmonton lost when number 99 put on a different jersey. The Oilers would win one more Stanley Cup in 1990 without Gretzky, a bittersweet achievement that proved the organization's depth, but also underlined how much poorer the franchise had become without its defining figure. What followed for Gretzky was a second act that would have defined any other player's entire legacy, but existed in his career as a fascinating, complicated, ultimately bittersweet continuation of a story whose happiest chapters had already been written. The Los Angeles years, the brief stop in St. Louis, the final seasons in New York, these would bring individual milestones, dramatic playoff moments, cultural transformation, and a slow physical decline that carried its own quiet tragedy. Each of these chapters deserves examination, and each reveals something essential about the man behind the records. But before we move forward, it is worth pausing to consider what had already been accomplished. By the time Wayne Gretzky left Edmonton at 27 years old, he had already secured his place as the greatest player in the history of the sport. He had already won 4 Stanley Cups, 5 Hart Trophies, 7 Art Ross Trophies, and accumulated statistical totals that players twice his age had never approached. He had already transformed the centre position, the Edmonton Oilers, the city of Edmonton, and the way the sport of hockey was understood and played. He had done all of this before his 28th birthday. What came after was remarkable in its own right. But what came before was something that transcends the language of sports and enters the vocabulary of art, a sustained, creative, competitive performance of such extraordinary quality and duration that it altered the fundamental possibilities of the game in which it was delivered. The boy from Brantford, the child who had been chased from his hometown by the jealousy of adults, the teenager who had been dismissed as too small and too slow, had built the greatest dynasty in hockey history and then been torn from it by forces beyond his control. The next chapter of his story would be written in a city where ice was made by machines and sunshine was the natural condition, a place as far from the frozen backyard rinks of Ontario as it was possible to go while remaining on the same continent. The story was about to change in ways no one could have predicted, and the man at the centre of it was about to demonstrate that greatness does not require ideal circumstances. It requires only the will to persist and the talent to perform, even when everything familiar has been stripped away. There is one more element of Wayne's early story that deserves attention before we leave this section, and it concerns the nature of the talent itself. Researchers and sports scientists have spent decades trying to understand what made Gretzky different. Was it reflexes? Studies suggested his reflexes were above average, but not extraordinary. Was it vision? His eyesight was excellent, but not measurably superhuman. Was it physical coordination? He was well coordinated, but not in a way that could be distinguished from dozens of other professional athletes through standardized testing. The answer, as nearly as anyone has been able to determine, lies not in any single measurable attribute, but in the integration of multiple cognitive abilities working together at a speed and depth that no testing protocol has been designed to capture. Gretzky's brain processed hockey information the way a chess grandmaster processes board positions, not by analyzing individual pieces but by recognizing patterns, entire configurations of players and movement that carried predictive meaning. When Gretzky looked at the ice, he did not see 10 individual players moving independently. He saw a system, a pattern, a configuration that his experience and training allowed him to match against thousands of previous configurations stored in his memory. The match happened instantaneously and unconsciously, producing not a calculated decision but an intuitive certainty about what was going to happen next and where the opportunity would appear. Walter Gretzky's backyard training, the figure eights and the stick handling and the puck tracing on paper had not merely developed Wayne's physical skills. It had built a cognitive library of hockey patterns so vast and so deeply internalized that accessing it required no conscious effort. When Wayne described seeing the game in slow motion, when he said that he simply knew where everyone was going to be, he was not exaggerating or being falsely modest. He was describing the subjective experience of a brain that had been trained from toddlerhood to process hockey information at a level no other human brain had ever been trained to achieve. This is important because it connects the beginning of the story to everything that follows. The backyard rink was not just a charming detail in the biography of a famous athlete. It was the crucible in which the greatest hockey mind in history was forged. Without Walter's training methods, Without the thousands of hours on that imperfect backyard ice, without the figure eights and the head-up stick handling and the puck tracings, there would have been no Wayne Gretzky as the world came to know him. The physical talent was necessary but insufficient. What made Gretzky the greatest was the cognitive architecture that Walter helped build, layer by patient layer, on the foundation of natural ability. It was nurture and nature working in perfect concert, producing a result that neither could have achieved alone. Understanding this makes what happened next even more remarkable, and what was lost even more painful. Because the cognitive architecture that Walter built could not be unbuilt by a trade or a change of scenery, or the slow deterioration of physical ability. The mind that saw the game in 4 dimensions would continue to see it that way long after the body could no longer execute what the mind envisioned. That gap between vision and execution would become one of the defining themes of the second half of Wayne Gretzky's career. A gap that widened year by year, game by game, until it became unbearable. And the only honest response was retirement. But that reckoning was years away. In the summer of 1988, Wayne Gretzky was heading to Los Angeles, and the world was about to discover that his impact on the sport extended far beyond what happened between the boards. And there was something else that the Brantford years and the Edmonton dynasty reveal about Wayne Gretzky that is often overlooked in the celebration of his statistics and records. It is the quality of his generosity, not just on the ice, where his 1,963 career assists attest to a player who derived as much satisfaction from setting up a teammate's goal as from scoring his own, but in his character. Despite the cruelty he endured as a child, he did not become bitter. Despite the fame that enveloped him before he had finished elementary school, he did not become arrogant. Despite being treated as the most important person in every room he entered from the age of 10 onward, he remained unfailingly polite, unfailingly gracious, unfailingly aware that the people around him had feelings and needs that mattered as much as his own. This graciousness was not performance. It was real. Teammates across every era of his career have spoken about it with a consistency that cannot be manufactured. He remembered names. He remembered details about people's families. He made rookies feel welcome. He deflected credit to line mates. He handled media obligations with patience and care, understanding that the reporter asking the same question for the 100th time was just doing his job. This behavior was not common among athletes of his stature then, and it is not common now. It reflected something fundamental about his character, something that survived the jealousy of Brantford, the pressure of Edmonton, the upheaval of the trade, and the slow diminishment of his physical abilities. He was, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a good person. And the story of Wayne Gretzky cannot be told completely without acknowledging that the greatest hockey player who ever lived was also, by virtually all accounts, one of the kindest. The trade to Los Angeles changed everything. It changed Wayne Gretzky's career trajectory, transforming him from the centerpiece of the most dominant dynasty in modern hockey into a solitary star trying to elevate a mediocre franchise through individual brilliance in a city that did not know what hockey was. It changed the NHL's geography, setting in motion a wave of expansion into American Sunbelt cities that would have seemed absurd and financially irresponsible a decade earlier. It changed the economics of the sport, demonstrating that hockey could generate revenue and cultural relevance in markets that had no traditional connection to ice or winter or Canadian sporting culture. And it changed the emotional landscape of Canadian hockey, creating a wound in the national psyche that took years to heal and that some would argue has never fully closed. To trace the key moments from this point forward is to trace the story of a man navigating the complex intersection of athletic greatness and personal loss, of professional triumphs achieved under diminished circumstances, and of the slow, inevitable erosion of physical ability that comes for every athlete regardless of their genius. The first defining moment of the post-Edmonton era was the arrival itself, the shock of transplantation from a hockey city to a city that treated hockey as an afterthought. When Gretzky joined the Kings for the 1988-89 season, he entered a hockey market that barely knew what hockey was. The Kings had existed since 1967, one of the original expansion franchises, but they had never won a Stanley Cup, never seriously contended for one, and had spent most of their existence as a middling franchise, generating modest interest in a metropolitan area, consumed by the Lakers, the Dodgers, and the Raiders. Their arena, the Great Western Forum in Inglewood, was often half empty on game nights, the empty seats a visible reminder that hockey in Los Angeles was a curiosity supported by a small, dedicated fan base, while the rest of the city's enormous population focused its sporting attention elsewhere. The idea that hockey could become mainstream entertainment in a city where it never snowed, where ice was something you put in drinks, where the cultural references that sustained hockey in Canada and the northern United States simply did not exist, seemed far-fetched to the point of absurdity. Gretzky changed that perception with astonishing, almost instantaneous speed. In his first season with the Kings, he scored 54 goals and added 114 assists for 168 points, winning the Hart Trophy as Most Valuable Player for the 9th time, a remarkable achievement that underscored the fact that his production had not diminished, despite the upheaval of the trade and the adjustment to a new team, new teammates, new systems, and a new city. But the statistics, extraordinary as they were, told only part of the story. The cultural transformation was more significant and more enduring than any individual season's statistics. Suddenly, Kings games were the place to be in Los Angeles. The phenomenon happened almost overnight. Within weeks of Gretzky's arrival, the Forum began selling out. Celebrities appeared at rinkside with increasing frequency. Hollywood actors and actresses wore Kings jerseys to premieres and award shows, not because they understood hockey, but because the Kings had become fashionable. And in Los Angeles, fashion is the currency of social status. The team's merchandise sales exploded. Season ticket waiting lists grew into the thousands. Television ratings in the Los Angeles market climbed dramatically. Gretzky had made hockey relevant in a market that should have been immune to its appeal, and he had done it not through marketing gimmicks or promotional campaigns, but through the simple, undeniable magnetism of extraordinary talent performing at the highest level night after night. The ripple effects extended far beyond Los Angeles and far beyond the Kings franchise. Within a few years of Gretzky's arrival in Southern California, the NHL awarded expansion franchises to San Jose, Tampa Bay, Ottawa, Anaheim, and Miami. The Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, owned by the Walt Disney Company and named after a Disney movie about youth hockey, were placed in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, specifically because Gretzky had proven that hockey could thrive in Southern California, that an audience existed for the sport in warm weather markets if the product was good enough and the star was bright enough. More franchises followed in subsequent years as the league continued its southward and westward push. Nashville, Atlanta, Columbus, and eventually Las Vegas. Gary Bettman, who became commissioner of the NHL in 1993, has credited Gretzky's move to Los Angeles as one of the most important catalysts for the league's modern growth strategy. The direct line between one player changing cities in August of 1988 and the NHL growing from 21 teams to 32 teams over the following 3 decades is acknowledged by virtually every historian of the sport as one of the most significant cause and effect relationships in professional sports history. Gretzky did not merely play hockey in Los Angeles. He planted the flag for an entire sport in a territory that had been considered permanently hostile to it. The transformation went beyond attendance figures and franchise locations. It changed the way hockey was perceived in the broader American cultural landscape, a shift whose importance cannot be overstated for a sport that had long struggled for visibility south of the Canadian border. Before Gretzky came to Los Angeles, hockey was seen as a regional sport in the United States, popular in New England, the upper Midwest, and pockets of New York and Pennsylvania, but invisible or irrelevant everywhere else. After Gretzky, hockey had a face that transcended regional boundaries, a face that appeared on the covers of national magazines, that was interviewed on national talk shows, that was recognized in grocery stores and restaurants in cities where hockey had never been discussed. The sport gained a mainstream visibility in the United States that it had never possessed before. And while that visibility has ebbed and flowed in the decades since, the foundation was laid during Gretzky's years in Los Angeles. Every American hockey fan who was converted during those years, every child who asked for skates for Christmas because they had seen Gretzky on television, every arena that was built in a Sunbelt city because investors believed hockey could work there, traces back to the moment an Edmonton Oiler became a Los Angeles King. The second defining moment came during the 1993 playoffs, a postseason run that remains one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged in NHL history. The Kings entered the playoffs as a competitive but not dominant team, certainly not considered serious Stanley Cup contenders by the national hockey media or the league's established powers. What followed over the course of 2 extraordinary months was a sustained display of individual brilliance that carried the Kings further than anyone had a right to expect, producing moments of controversy, triumph, heartbreak, and individual greatness that would be replayed and debated for decades. In the first round against the Calgary Flames, a traditional Alberta rival whose fans still harboured deep resentment toward Gretzky for leaving Edmonton, the series became a war of attrition, with the Kings trailing 3-2 and facing elimination in Game 6. An incident occurred that would become one of the most fiercely debated moments in the history of the NHL playoffs. During overtime, with both teams pressing desperately, Gretzky's stick caught Calgary's Doug Gilmour high in the face, opening a cut that drew blood. The infraction, by the rules as they existed, should have been assessed as a 5-minute major penalty and an automatic game misconduct, which would have ejected Gretzky from the game and given the Flames an extended power play in overtime of an elimination game. But referee Kerry Fraser, one of the most respected officials in the league, did not see the infraction clearly in real time and assessed only a minor penalty. Gretzky served the 2-minute penalty, returned to the ice, and then scored the overtime goal that kept the Kings alive and tied the series at 3 games apiece. In Game 7, he scored 3 goals, a hat-trick, in a commanding, dominant performance that eliminated Calgary and sent the Kings to the second round. The missed call remains, more than 3 decades later, a source of profound and enduring bitterness among Calgary Flames fans. It has become one of those moments in sports that serves as a litmus test for allegiance. If you are a Kings fan, it was an unfortunate, but ultimately inconsequential, missed call in a series that Gretzky was destined to win regardless. If you are a Flames fan, it was one of the greatest injustices in the history of professional sports, a stolen victory that altered the trajectory of the entire postseason. Kerry Fraser has discussed the play extensively in the years since, acknowledging that he missed the call and expressing regret or whatnot, noting that officials make decisions in fractions of seconds under enormous pressure. Whether the non-call altered the ultimate course of the series, or whether Gretzky would have found a way to win regardless, because that is what great players do in great moments, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty, only debated with passion. The controversies did not diminish the quality or the emotional intensity of what followed. The Kings advanced past the Vancouver Canucks in the second round and then faced the Toronto Maple Leafs in the Campbell Conference Finals, a series that stretched to 7 games and featured some of the most emotionally charged hockey of the entire decade. The Maple Leafs were coached by Pat Burns, a demanding and tactically sophisticated coach who built his teams on defensive discipline and physical intimidation. They were led offensively by Doug Gilmour, who was in the midst of the finest season of his excellent career, playing with a combination of skill, competitiveness, and determination that made him one of the most dangerous players in the league. The atmosphere in Maple Leaf Gardens during the Toronto home games was electric, supercharged with the fierce, almost desperate desire of a fan base that had not seen a Stanley Cup since 1967, and that believed, with the fervour of the long-suffering, that this might finally be their year. But Gretzky was magnificent. In Game 7, played at Maple Leaf Gardens before a crowd that willed the Leafs forward with every breath, he scored 3 goals, his second hat-trick in a decisive 7th game in the same playoff year. 2 Game 7 hat-tricks in a single postseason. The achievement is almost impossible to contextualize. Game 7s are the most pressurized environment in professional hockey. the winner-take-all culmination of weeks of physical and emotional warfare. To produce a hat trick in that environment once would be the defining moment of most players' careers. Gretzky did it twice in the same spring, willing his team past opponents who were younger, deeper, and playing at home. He carried the Kings into the Stanley Cup finals through sheer individual force, producing at a level that no other player in the series could approach. The opponent in the finals was the Montreal Canadiens, and the series would prove to be the most painful experience of Gretzky's post-Edmonton career. It was the first and only time he would reach the finals as a member of the Kings, and the opportunity carried an almost unbearable weight of expectation and desire. He was 32 years old. His body was beginning to show the accumulated wear of 14 NHL seasons, the stiffness in his back, the diminished explosion in his stride, the small hesitations that spoke of chronic pain managed but never eliminated. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around him, that this might be his last realistic chance to add to the 4 championships he had won in Edmonton. His last opportunity to prove that his greatness could transcend the circumstances of his trade and deliver a championship to a franchise and a city that had never experienced one. The series was a profound disappointment. Montreal's goaltender, Patrick Roy, was at the absolute peak of his considerable powers, performing at a level that placed him among the greatest playoff contenders in the history of the sport. Roy was in the midst of one of the most dominant individual postseason performances ever recorded by a goaltender, turning aside shots with a combination of extraordinary athleticism, precise positioning, lightning reflexes, and a competitive ferocity that seemed to grow stronger as the pressure intensified. The Kings could not solve him. They generated chances, created quality scoring opportunities, and hit posts and crossbars with maddening frequency, but Roy was equal to everything they threw at him. Montreal won the series in 5 games, and Gretzky was left with a loss that cut more deeply than any defeat he had experienced since entering the league. The numbers he had produced during the postseason made the loss even more painful. He recorded 40 points in the playoffs, one of the highest individual totals in the history of the league. He had carried a team that had no business being in the Stanley Cup finals, a team that lacked the depth and defensive structure of the great Edmonton teams, to within 4 victories of the championship. He had produced 2 Game 7 hat tricks, had been the best player on the ice in virtually every game of the first 3 rounds, and had demonstrated that his competitive fire burned as hot at 32 as it had at 22. And he had come up short. The cup eluded him in Los Angeles. It would elude him for the rest of his career. He would never play in another Stanley Cup final. It was also during his time in Los Angeles that Gretzky achieved one of the most emotionally resonant individual milestones in the history of the sport. On October 15, 1989, just over a year after the trade, he surpassed Gordie Howe's all-time NHL scoring record of 1,850 career points. The milestone was reached in a twist of circumstance so perfect that it seemed designed by a screenwriter rather than produced by the random scheduling of a professional sports league in Edmonton at the Northlands Coliseum against the very team that had traded him. Gordie Howe himself was at the game, watching from a luxury suite alongside the NHL commissioner as the player who had inherited his mantle as hockey's greatest living legend passed his most treasured record. The celebration on the ice lasted several minutes. Play was stopped. Both teams lined up to congratulate Gretzky. The Edmonton fans, despite the raw wound of the trade that still ached in their hearts, gave Gretzky a standing ovation that shook the old Northlands Coliseum to its foundations. The sound was enormous and sustained, a roar of love and pride and loss that contained within it the entire complicated emotional history between a player and the city he had been taken from. It was a moment of pure, unscripted emotion, a bridge between 2 eras of hockey greatness, and it reminded everyone who witnessed it that some accomplishments transcend the petty boundaries of team loyalty and civic resentment. Gretzky wept openly on the ice, overcome by the significance of the milestone and the unexpected, overwhelming warmth of the reception from fans he had been torn from just over a year earlier. Howe embraced him. The moment was captured by cameras and broadcast across the country, becoming one of the most replayed and cherished scenes in the history of Canadian sports broadcasting. The third defining moment of this chapter was the physical decline that every athlete must eventually confront, but that few are forced to navigate under the glare of attention that accompanied Gretzky's every move. Hockey is a violent sport. Even a player who avoids fighting, as Gretzky consistently did throughout his career, cannot escape the cumulative toll of being checked, hooked, slashed, cross-checked, elbowed, and driven into the boards over the course of 20 professional seasons. The human body was not designed to absorb that kind of punishment repeatedly, and it extracts its price from everyone eventually, regardless of their status or their gifts. Throughout the 80s in Edmonton, Gretzky had been protected by enforcers like Dave Semenko and Marty McSorley, large and physically intimidating teammates whose job was to ensure that opposing players paid a steep price for taking liberties with the league's most valuable player. The implicit threat of retribution kept most opponents from targeting Gretzky with the kind of cheap shot and after-the-whistle violence that could have shortened his career. As the years passed, as Gretzky moved to different teams and rosters changed, that protective shield diminished, and the toll of unprotected contact increased. In 1992, Gretzky suffered a herniated thoracic disc in his back, an injury that would alter the trajectory of his remaining career. The injury was particularly cruel because it affected not just his mobility on the ice, where it limited his ability to twist, accelerate, and absorb contact, but his daily comfort off the ice, making it difficult to sit for extended periods, to sleep without pain, or to perform routine physical activities without discomfort. The injury never fully healed. It became a chronic condition managed through a combination of medical treatment, physical therapy, anti-inflammatory medication, and sheer determination. Gretzky adapted his game, relying even more heavily on intelligence, positioning, and passing as his physical abilities eroded. The adaptation was itself a testament to his genius. Most hockey players who lose a step in their skating see their production decline dramatically because their game is built on speed and physical engagement. Gretzky remained productive because his game had never been built primarily on speed or strength. It was built on vision, anticipation, and creative intelligence, and those qualities do not deteriorate the way muscles and joints and discs do. The back injury introduced a new and unwelcome reality into Gretzky's career. He began missing games with a regularity that would have been unthinkable during his prime years in Edmonton, when he seemed impervious to the physical demands of the schedule. His skating, always unorthodox by conventional standards, became stiffer and more cautious, lacking the subtle fluidity that had allowed him to slip away from checks and drift into open ice with deceptive ease. He could no longer twist and turn through traffic with the fluidity he had possessed in his 20s. He compensated with positioning, anticipation, and an even more cerebral approach to the game, reading plays earlier, releasing the puck faster, finding simpler solutions that demanded less of his diminished body. But there were nights when the pain was visible in his movement, nights when the gap between what his mind envisioned and what his body could execute was painful to watch for those who remembered what he had been at his peak. The fourth defining moment was his departure from Los Angeles and the nomadic final chapter of his playing career. In February of 1996, with the Kings struggling financially and Gretzky's contract representing a significant financial burden, he was traded to the St. Louis Blues. The transaction was far less dramatic than the earthquake of the '88 trade, accompanied by neither tears nor national mourning, but it carried its own quiet significance. Gretzky played 18 regular season games and 7 playoff games for the Blues. The fit was imperfect, the circumstances awkward, and negotiations for a long-term contract faltered over terms. That summer, Gretzky signed as a free agent with the New York Rangers, reuniting with his former Edmonton teammate and close friend Mark Messier. The Rangers' years were bittersweet, a word that applies with precision to this final chapter. Gretzky arrived in New York at 35, well past his physical prime but still capable of flashes of brilliance that recalled the player he had been a decade earlier. Moments when the vision and the hands and the hockey intelligence would align perfectly and produce a play that reminded everyone in the building what genius looked like. His first Rangers season produced 97 points, a total that would represent a career year for most players, but was a shadow of his peak production. The Rangers were a good but not great team during his tenure. They reached the playoffs in his first year and lost in the second round. They missed the playoffs entirely in his second year, a deeply unsatisfying experience for a player accustomed to competing for championships. In his third and final season, they returned to the postseason, but were eliminated quickly. The Stanley Cup never came. Gretzky played his final 3 NHL seasons without adding to the 4 championships he had won a decade earlier in Edmonton. The fifth and most poignant, defining moment was his final game, a farewell that the entire sporting world watched with the knowledge that something irreplaceable was ending. On April 18, 1999, Wayne Gretzky played his last NHL game at Madison Square Garden in New York City. The opponent was the Pittsburgh Penguins, led by Jaromir Jagr, one of the most talented forwards of the next generation. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion from the moment the players took the ice for warm-ups. The hockey world knew this was the end. Gretzky had announced his retirement days earlier, and tributes had poured in from presidents, prime ministers, fellow athletes across every sport, and millions of fans who had grown up watching him play. The NHL announced that number 99 would be retired league-wide, a distinction unprecedented in professional hockey and virtually unmatched in any major North American professional sport. No team in the National Hockey League would ever again issue number 99 to any player. The number belonged to one man, forever. The game itself was secondary to the ceremony and the emotion, but it produced its own moments of grace. Gretzky assisted on a goal by Brian Lech and created other chances, looking for stretches like the player he had been a decade and more earlier, his passes still arriving with precision, even if his body no longer moved with the speed to create them as frequently. The Rangers lost 3-1, a result that mattered to no one. After the final buzzer sounded, Gretzky took a long, slow lap around the Madison Square Garden ice. The crowd stood. Every person in the building was on their feet. The ovation did not pause or diminish. It continued unbroken for several minutes as Gretzky circled the rink, waving to the crowd, his eyes red with tears, his expression a mixture of gratitude and grief, and the specific sadness of a man saying goodbye to the only thing he had ever wanted to do. When it was over, he stepped off the ice for the final time, carrying a career of 894 goals, 1,963 assists, 2,857 total points, 4 Stanley Cup championships, 9 Hart Trophies, 10 Art Ross trophies, and 61 individual records. Beyond these defining domestic moments, there were contributions on the international stage that added essential chapters to the Gretzky narrative. The 1987 Canada Cup featured one of the greatest international hockey tournaments ever played, and its climax produced arguably the most famous single play in the history of the sport. The final series against the Soviet Union went to a decisive third game, with the first 2 games having been split. In the third game, tied late in the final period with the tension unbearable, Gretzky carried the puck into the Soviet zone with the calm, purposeful stride of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. He drew the Soviet defenders toward him, waited an extra fraction of a second as the defense collapsed in his direction, and then delivered a perfect pass across the slot to Mario Lemieux, who one-timed the puck past the Soviet goaltender for the winning goal. The play combined the 2 greatest players of their generation, acting in concert on the biggest stage available to them, producing the most dramatic goal in the most pressurized possible moment. Gretzky would later call the Canada Cup and that specific tournament one of the proudest achievements of his entire career, ranking it alongside his Stanley Cup victories. The rivalry with Lemieux, if it can fairly be called a rivalry, when it was defined more by mutual admiration than competitive animosity, deserves careful examination because it illuminates the unique nature of Gretzky's dominance. Mario Lemieux was the only player of his era who could consistently challenge Gretzky for the title of best in the world. Lemieux was taller, stronger, and possessed a shot that Gretzky could not match in terms of raw power and accuracy. When healthy, Lemieux was capable of matching and even surpassing Gretzky's per-game production, displaying a combination of size, skill, and creativity that was unlike anything the sport had seen. He won 6 Hart Ross trophies as scoring champion, 3 Hart Trophies as most valuable player, and 2 Stanley Cup championships with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But health was his constant and cruel enemy. Chronic back injuries similar to Gretzky's but more severe, combined with a battle against Hodgkin lymphoma that interrupted his career at its peak, limited Lemieux to 915 career games compared to Gretzky's 1,487. The cumulative gap in games played left Gretzky's career records untouched and untouchable. Lemieux himself, a fiercely proud competitor who did not distribute compliments freely, always acknowledged Gretzky as the greatest player who ever lived, a concession that meant more coming from the one man who had the strongest case to dispute it. The coaching relationships across Gretzky's career also shaped his trajectory in ways that deserve mention. Glenn Sather in Edmonton built the offensive system that maximized Gretzky's genius, giving him unprecedented freedom to roam the ice, to position himself wherever his instincts directed, rather than following the rigid positional assignments that most coaches demanded. Sather surrounded Gretzky with complementary players, chosen specifically for their ability to convert his vision into goals, and trusted Gretzky's judgment on the ice absolutely. Their partnership, the creative genius, and the coach wise enough to give that genius room to operate, was as essential to the Edmonton dynasty as Gretzky's individual talent. In Los Angeles, the coaching was more varied and less perfectly calibrated to Gretzky's unique gifts. Barry Melrose coached the magical '93 playoff run with an enthusiastic, players-first approach that suited the moment. But the Kings never possessed Edmonton's depth or defensive structure, and no coach could manufacture those qualities through tactical innovation alone. The enduring question of era context deserves direct and thorough address because it is the only serious argument ever leveled against Gretzky's statistical dominance. The 1980s were a high-scoring period in NHL history, an era when average goals per game exceeded 4 per team on many nights. Critics have argued that Gretzky's numbers were inflated by this permissive environment, that his point totals were products of their time rather than evidence of transcendent individual talent. The counter-argument is devastating in its simplicity. In every season during the high-scoring era, Gretzky finished dramatically ahead of everyone else playing in the same environment. If the era inflated his numbers, it inflated everyone's numbers equally, yet the gap between Gretzky and the rest of the field remained enormous, often preposterously so. The 74-point gap between first and second in 1985 to 86 was not an artifact of the era, it was an artifact of Gretzky. His playoff numbers eliminate any residual doubt. The postseason is where pretenders are exposed and genuine greatness is confirmed, because the competition intensifies, the scrutiny increases, and the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. Gretzky holds the all-time record for playoff points with 382. He won the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff most valuable player twice. His postseason production, achieved against the best teams playing their absolute best hockey, was as dominant relative to his peers as his regular season numbers. The argument that he was merely a product of his era collapses entirely when you examine the evidence with intellectual rigor rather than with the selective skepticism that accompanies any form of unmatched greatness. The truth is that Gretzky's records were built to endure. The all-time career scoring record of 2,857 points is so far ahead of any active player's trajectory that no one currently playing is on pace to approach it, let alone surpass it. The record is not in danger. It may never be. It stands as a permanent monument to what one player accomplished across 2 decades of professional hockey, and the monument grows more imposing with each passing year as the gap between what Gretzky achieved and what the modern game, with its superior goaltending, its advanced defensive systems, and its comprehensive analytics, allows any single player to achieve, becomes more and more apparent. The records are not just safe, They are becoming, with each new season that fails to produce anyone remotely close, more secure than they were the day they were set. The numbers are striking when you step back and view the full scope of what Wayne Gretzky accomplished, not just in one chapter, but across the entire arc of his career. He played 20 professional seasons, beginning as an 18-year-old in the World Hockey Association and ending as a 38-year-old at Madison Square Garden. Across those 20 seasons, he led the league in scoring 10 times. He won the Hart Trophy 9 times. He scored 50 or more goals in a season 9 times. He recorded 100 or more assists in a season 11 times. He produced 100 or more points in a season 16 times, including 15 consecutive seasons. No other player has achieved that level of sustained, year-over-year dominance in the history of the sport, and no statistical model projects that any player in the foreseeable future will approach it. Consider the assists record in particular, because it reveals more about Gretzky's playing philosophy than any other statistic. 1,963 career assists. The number is so large that it dwarfs the assist totals of every other player who has ever played the game. The next highest career assist total belongs to Ron Francis with 1,249. The gap between Gretzky and second place in career assists is 714. 714 assists. That gap alone would represent a Hall of Fame career for most players. It separates the greatest from the next best by a margin that has no parallel in professional sports statistics. What the assists tell us is that Gretzky was, at his core, a giver. He derived as much satisfaction from setting up a teammate for a goal as he did from scoring himself. Perhaps more, the assist requires vision, anticipation, timing, precision, and selflessness. It requires the willingness to pass the puck to a teammate in a better position rather than attempting the shot yourself. It requires trust in your teammate's ability to finish the play, and it requires an understanding of the game so deep and so comprehensive that you can identify the scoring opportunity before it fully materializes and deliver the puck to the right spot at the right moment with the right speed and angle. Gretzky did this more often than anyone who has ever played any team sport, and his assist record may be the single most unbreakable record in all of professional athletics. There is also a dimension of his career that is often overlooked in the discussion of records and milestones: his consistency across different teams and different decades. Gretzky was dominant in Edmonton during the early and mid-80s. He was dominant in Los Angeles during the late 80s and early 90s. He was productive in St. Louis and New York during the late 90s. Even as his body deteriorated and the game around him evolved, he adapted his style to accommodate his changing physical capabilities without ever losing the essential quality that made him great: the ability to see the game more clearly and think about it more deeply than anyone else on the ice. This adaptability extended to the evolving tactical landscape of the sport. The NHL of the late 90s was a dramatically different environment from the NHL of the early 80s. Defensive systems had become more sophisticated and more restrictive. The neutral zone trap, popularized by coaches like Jacques Lemaire, choked the life out of offensive creativity by clogging the middle of the ice with defenders who focused on taking away passing lanes rather than pursuing the puck. Goaltending equipment had expanded dramatically in size, reducing the amount of visible net that shooters could target. The overall scoring rate dropped steadily throughout the 90s, making the 200-point seasons of Gretzky's prime seem like dispatches from a different sporting universe. Gretzky navigated these changes with the quiet intelligence that defined everything he did. He could not overpower the new systems. He could not outskate the younger, faster defenders who populated rosters built for speed. What he could do was outthink them, finding the small seams and brief openings that the new systems could not eliminate entirely, exploiting them with passes of surgical precision that younger, less experienced players would not have recognized as opportunities. His production declined in absolute terms, as it would have for any player facing the twin challenges of aging and a changing tactical environment, but his relative quality remained extraordinary. He was still, in his final seasons, one of the most intelligent and creative players on the ice on any given night, even if his body could no longer sustain that quality for an entire 60-minute game. The final game at Madison Square Garden was not just the end of a career. It was the closing of a chapter in the history of professional sports that will not be reopened. The combination of individual statistical dominance, cultural impact, and sustained excellence that Gretzky achieved across 2 decades exists outside the range of what modern professional hockey, with its parity-driven salary cap and its increasingly sophisticated defensive systems, allows any individual to accomplish. Future players may win championships, may break individual season records in categories where the records are approachable, and may captivate audiences with extraordinary talent. But no future player will accumulate 2,857 career points. No future player will record 1,963 assists. No future player will hold 61 records simultaneously. The window through which that level of individual dominance was possible has closed, and it closed behind Wayne Gretzky as he took his final lap around the garden ice. That is the weight of his key moments and his challenges. They form a narrative not just of individual achievement, but of a sports transformation, told through the career of the one person most responsible for that transformation. From Edmonton to Los Angeles to St. Louis to New York, from the dynasty years through the cultural revolution through the physical decline, every chapter added something essential to the story, and every chapter pointed toward the same conclusion. This was a career unlike any other, played by a man unlike any other, in a sport that was permanently changed by his presence. One aspect of Gretzky's career that deserves additional consideration is the way he handled the transition from being the unquestioned best player in the world to being merely excellent. That transition began gradually in the early 90s and accelerated through the middle of the decade. For most athletes, the loss of their status as the best in their sport is a source of frustration, bitterness, or denial. Some fight it publicly, insisting they are still at the peak when the evidence suggests otherwise. Some retreat from the spotlight, unwilling to be seen performing below the standard they once set. Gretzky did neither. He accepted the diminishment of his physical abilities with a grace that reflected the maturity and emotional intelligence he had developed over a lifetime in the public eye. He did not complain about injuries publicly, though the back pain was constant and debilitating. He did not blame teammates or coaches for results that fell short of expectations. He did not engage in the kind of self-pitying commentary that would have been understandable, even forgivable, from a man whose body was betraying the still brilliant mind it housed. He simply continued to play, continued to prepare, continued to compete, and continued to find ways to contribute, even as the contributions became less frequent and less spectacular than they had once been. This quiet dignity in decline is one of the most admirable aspects of Gretzky's career, and one that is frequently overlooked in favour of the more spectacular elements: the records, the championships, the cultural impact. But it speaks to the character of the man as much as any of his accomplishments on the ice. He understood that careers have arcs, that youth gives way to maturity, and maturity gives way to decline, and that the measure of a professional is not just how he performs at his peak, but how he comports himself when the peak has passed. There was also the matter of his impact on the business of hockey, which extended well beyond ticket sales and television ratings. Gretzky's presence in Los Angeles elevated the profile of every NHL player who followed him. It contributed to larger television contracts that increased revenue for every team in the league. It helped secure corporate sponsorships from national and international brands that had previously ignored hockey. It made the NHL visible enough in the American market to compete, however unevenly, with the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball for media attention and advertising dollars. Every player who has benefited from a larger salary cap, a more lucrative endorsement market, or a broader media platform owes a portion of that benefit, directly or indirectly, to the trail Wayne Gretzky blazed when he put on a Los Angeles Kings jersey in the fall of 1988. The key moments and challenges of Wayne Gretzky's career are not merely entries in a record book. They are chapters in the story of how one individual changed the trajectory of an entire sport through a combination of individual genius, quiet determination, and the willingness to carry burdens that would have crushed a less resilient person. Each moment, from the exhilaration of the dynasty years to the heartbreak of the '93 finals to the quiet dignity of his farewell at Madison Square Garden, contributes to a narrative that is simultaneously a sports story and something larger, a meditation on what it means to be the best at something and what it costs. Here is where we move past the statistics and the trophies and the records and the playoff battles, and into the quieter, heavier territory of what Wayne Gretzky's life reveals about the cost of greatness. Because for all the adulation, for all the worship, for all the times he was called the Great One, with a reverence usually reserved for figures of historical or spiritual significance, there is a sadness that runs through this story like a minor chord beneath a symphony. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it does not announce itself with the urgency of a playoff loss or the spectacle of a broken record. It is the quiet, persistent ache of a man who gave himself so completely to one thing that other parts of his life were left to develop in the shadows, untended and underserved, while the world focused its attention on the dazzling brilliance at the center. Start with his father, because that is where the story begins and that is where the deepest pain resides. Walter Gretzky was the architect of Wayne's career in the most literal and fundamental sense. He built the backyard rink with his own hands, flooding it layer by layer with a garden hose in the bitter Ontario cold. He drove Wayne to practices and games across the province in the early morning darkness, before heading to his own job at the telephone company, swallowing fatigue and discomfort without complaint because his son needed to be at the rink. And Walter understood that need with a depth that went beyond parental obligation into something closer to sacred duty. He sat with Wayne in the living room, watching Hockey Night in Canada, and had him trace puck movements on paper, building the cognitive library that would become the foundation of the greatest career in team sports. He taught Wayne to see hockey the way no one else could see it, to anticipate the flow of play, to understand the game as a system of patterns rather than a series of disconnected events. Walter was beloved across Canada, a folk hero in his own right, the humble telephone repairman from a small Ontario city who had raised the greatest hockey player who ever lived. He deflected praise with a modesty that felt genuine because it was genuine. He was not performing humility, he was humble. In October of 1991, during Wayne's third season in Los Angeles, Walter suffered a brain aneurysm that nearly killed him. The aneurysm ruptured without warning, as aneurysms do, sending Walter into emergency surgery, where doctors fought to save his life. He survived. He recovered physically to a remarkable degree, eventually returning to many of his normal activities and continuing the community involvement that had made him one of the most recognized and admired figures in Canadian civic life. But the damage to his brain was severe and permanent. Walter lost the majority of his long-term memory. He could not remember Wayne's childhood. He could not remember the backyard rink, the pylons he had set up on the ice, the figure eights he had made Wayne skate, until the patterns became second nature. He could not remember the hours of stick-handling drills, the instructions to keep his head up, the patient repetition that had built a cognitive architecture unlike any the sport had ever seen. He could not remember the goals, the trophies, the championships. He could not remember the screaming parents in the Brantford Arena stands, the newspaper reporters filming his 10-year-old son, the pride and pain of watching Wayne become a national figure. Before he had finished elementary school, he could not remember teaching Wayne to skate. The man who dedicated his entire adult life to building Wayne Gretzky's career, who sacrificed sleep and comfort and personal ambition so that his eldest son could fulfill a potential that Walter alone had recognized when Wayne was barely old enough to walk, could no longer recall that the career had happened. Let that sink in. Wayne visited regularly throughout the years that followed, traveling from wherever he was playing to spend time with his father. He brought videotapes of old games, grainy recordings of overtime goals, and Stanley Cup celebrations, hoping that the images might unlock something in Walter's damaged brain. He brought trophies and photographs and newspaper clippings, physical evidence of a shared history that existed now in only one mind. He told stories, patiently and lovingly recounting experiences that should have been shared memories, but had become Wayne's alone. Walter listened with the warmth and genuine interest that had always defined his character. He was grateful for the attention, He was kind and present and engaged, but the memories were gone. The neural pathways that had stored a lifetime of shared experience, the moments of joy and struggle and triumph that a father and son had lived through together, had been destroyed by a ruptured blood vessel in a matter of seconds. The shared foundation of their bond, the thousands of hours of practice and travel and teaching that had produced the greatest career in team sports history, existed in only one mind. Walter remembered fragments, disconnected images that floated without context in a damaged memory. The complete narrative, the full story of what they had built together, was carried by Wayne alone. Walter Gretzky passed away on March 4, 2021, at the age of 82. The tributes were enormous, reflecting Canada's genuine love for the man who had given the country its most treasured athlete and its most enduring sporting narrative. Newspapers published lengthy remembrances. The Prime Minister offered condolences. The hockey world mourned collectively. But beneath the tributes and the kind words was a truth that Wayne had lived with for 3 decades. His father could not remember making him into the Great One. The distance between what was achieved and what was remembered, between the magnitude of the accomplishment and the completeness of its erasure from the mind of the person most responsible for it, is one of the saddest and most quietly devastating gaps in the history of sport. And the truth gets heavier when you consider that Wayne carried this weight privately, with characteristic grace, for 30 years before Walter's passing released him from the specific pain of visiting a father who loved him deeply but could not recall why the world considered his son extraordinary. Then, there is the trade and what it revealed about the nature of professional athletics and the relationships between athletes and the communities they represent. The 1988 trade to Los Angeles left wounds that never fully closed, not in Wayne, not in Edmonton, not in the broader Canadian consciousness. Wayne was asked repeatedly throughout the rest of his career and into retirement whether he had wanted to leave Edmonton. His answers were always careful, always diplomatic, always tinged with a sadness that no amount of time could fully dissolve. He loved Edmonton. He loved his teammates with the fierce, particular love that comes from winning championships together, from sharing the most intense, competitive experiences a human being can undergo, from trusting each other in moments when everything is at stake. He loved the fans who had embraced him with a devotion that bordered on the religious. He did not want to leave, but he was traded by an owner who needed money, and the experience of being treated as a commodity, of having his professional fate determined by the financial needs of a businessman, rather than by his own desires or his teammates' interests, left a permanent mark on his understanding of professional sports and his place within them. The trade revealed something uncomfortable and ultimately inescapable about the bond between athletes and the cities they represent. Edmonton mourned Gretzky's departure with a grief that was real and profound, but not entirely selfless. Some of the grief was genuine love for a man who had given the city its greatest moments. Some was resentment that a small Canadian city had lost its most famous citizen to glamorous, sun-drenched Los Angeles, that blue-collar Edmonton had been abandoned for Hollywood. Some was wounded national pride, the feeling that Canada itself had been diminished by the departure of its greatest athlete to an American city that did not understand or appreciate the sport he played. The complexity of the griefs speaks to a truth about professional athletics that is rarely examined with sufficient honesty. Athletes carry the hopes, the identities, and the self-image of entire communities on their shoulders, and the weight of that burden is heavier than most people realize or acknowledge. Let that sink in. A man who brought 4 Stanley Cup championships to a city, who transformed that city from an anonymous oil industry outpost into an internationally recognized sporting capital, who gave millions of people some of the happiest moments of their lives, was mourned not just because he was leaving, but because his leaving represented a loss of civic identity, a diminishment of collective self-worth that went far beyond sports. The question of life after hockey is perhaps the most revealing and in some ways the most difficult chapter of the Wayne Gretzky story. Gretzky retired at 38, and the transition from active player to private citizen was profoundly difficult, a struggle that he navigated with characteristic public grace. while privately grappling with the disorientation that afflicts virtually every elite athlete who leaves competition behind. He served as managing partner and head of hockey operations for the Phoenix Coyotes, a Sunbelt franchise that struggled financially throughout his tenure and never achieved the kind of competitive success that could have validated his front office acumen. He then coached the team for 4 seasons, from 2005 through 2009, compiling a record that was mediocre by any objective standard, failing to reach the playoffs in any of his 4 seasons behind the bench. The greatest player in the history of hockey was not a great coach. This should not surprise anyone who thinks carefully about the nature of transcendent athletic talent. The qualities that made Gretzky the most dominant player in team sports history, his supernatural vision, his instinctive understanding of spatial relationships on the ice, his ability to process the movement of 10 players simultaneously and predict where each would be a second or 2 into the future, were not qualities that could be transferred through instruction, demonstration, or explanation. You cannot teach someone to see what Gretzky saw any more than you can teach someone to compose music like Mozart or paint like Vermeer. The gift was innate, developed and refined through Walter's training, but rooted in cognitive architecture that was unique to Wayne Gretzky, and that existed, as far as anyone can determine, in no other human brain before or since. As a coach, Gretzky could describe what he saw when he looked at the ice. He could explain his logic, trace the path his mind followed from observation to decision, but he could not transmit the ability to see the game as he saw it. And without that ability, his instructions were a map of a country only he had visited, a guide written in a language that only he could read. Players reported that his feedback was sometimes difficult to act upon because it assumed a level of spatial awareness and anticipatory thinking that was simply beyond what normal human cognition could achieve. He was not a poor communicator. He was communicating insights from a perspective that no one else shared. There were personal difficulties during this period as well, difficulties that tested his composure and threatened the carefully maintained public image that had defined his post-playing life. In 2006, his name surfaced in connection with an illegal gambling ring operated by his assistant coach with the Coyotes, Rick Tocchet. The investigation was extensive and generated intense media coverage, the kind of coverage that feeds on the gap between an athlete's pristine public image and the suggestion of scandal lurking beneath it. Gretzky was never charged with any offense. Investigators concluded that he had not placed bets or participated in the gambling operation in any way, but his wife Janet was reportedly involved, and the scandal generated headlines and speculation that Wayne found deeply painful. He handled it with the quiet dignity that had characterized his public life from the beginning, answering questions directly when asked, declining to speculate or engage with rumors, and waiting with patience for the facts to clear his name, which they eventually did. The deeper truth that emerges from the post-playing years is that Wayne Gretzky's genius was exquisitely, almost painfully specific. It was calibrated to the precise demands of playing professional hockey at the highest level, and it did not translate easily or naturally to any other domain of human endeavor. He was not a natural or particularly compelling public speaker, though he improved with practice. He was not a riveting television analyst, lacking the assertive personality and willingness to criticize that the medium demands. He was not a visionary business executive. He was not a transformative coach. He was a hockey player, the greatest who ever lived. And when the hockey ended, when the activity that activated his unique cognitive gifts was removed from his daily life, the vessel that had held his genius had no liquid to contain. This is the paradox of transcendent athletic talent, a paradox that applies not just to Gretzky, but to many of the greatest athletes across every sport. The specificity that makes the talent extraordinary also makes it confining. The neural pathways that allowed Gretzky to process hockey at superhuman speed were hockey pathways, carved by tens of thousands of hours of practice on backyard ice and professional rinks, refined by competitive experience at the highest level over 20 years. When the game that activated those pathways was removed, they did not redirect to business or broadcasting or coaching or any other pursuit with comparable effectiveness. They were, in the most literal neurological sense, hockey pathways, and nothing else quite fit. He was left, like many retired athletes before and since, searching for something that could replicate the clarity, the intensity, the sense of purpose and mastery that competitive athletics had provided, finding that nothing could. The search is not unique to Gretzky. It is the common experience of elite athletes across every sport who retire and discover that the rest of life, however comfortable and privileged, lacks the vivid immediacy of competition. But the search is perhaps more poignant in Gretzky's case, because the height from which he fell was so much greater than anyone else's. No one had ever been as good at anything in team sports as Wayne Gretzky was at playing hockey. The gap between the peak and everything that followed was correspondingly vast. There is also the complicated and endlessly debated question of his legacy's consequences for the sport itself. Gretzky's move to Los Angeles helped grow hockey in the United States, expanding the league's footprint and revenue base in ways that benefited every franchise and every player. But the growth brought its own set of debates and tensions. Expansion created new fans and new revenue streams, but it also diluted the talent pool. More teams meant more roster spots for players who might not have been skilled enough to play in a smaller, more concentrated league. Traditionalists argue that expansion cheapened the product, spreading talent too thin across too many teams and reducing the average quality of play. Others argue that expansion brought the sport to millions of new fans who would never have experienced it otherwise, and that the modern NHL's remarkable international diversity, with players from dozens of countries contributing at the highest level, is a direct and beneficial result of Gretzky's impact on the sport's visibility and accessibility. Both views have merit. Both contain elements of truth. The reality lies somewhere in the contested territory between nostalgia for what the sport was and appreciation for what it has become, and reasonable people can and do disagree about which side of that territory they prefer. What is beyond debate is the emotional weight of Wayne Gretzky's career when considered in its entirety. He holds records that may never be approached, let alone broken. He won championships at a rate that has no parallel among players of his era. He transformed a sport's geography and economics through the simple act of changing teams. And yet his life story is not a simple triumph. It is a story of extraordinary gifts and ordinary human losses, of championships won and memories stolen by illness, of records that will endure for generations and relationships complicated by the relentless demands of fame and public life. It reminds us, with a clarity that is both beautiful and painful, that greatness carries a weight that few can comprehend and fewer still can sustain without paying a price that no trophy or record can adequately compensate. There is one final dimension of the deeper truth that must be addressed, and it concerns the way Wayne Gretzky experienced time. For a player whose entire genius was built on anticipation, on seeing the future before it arrived, retirement presented a uniquely disorienting challenge. On the ice, Gretzky lived 2 seconds ahead of the present moment, his mind perpetually occupied with what was about to happen rather than what was happening now. Every decision he made was forward-looking. Every pass was delivered to a future location. Every positioning choice was based on prediction rather than reaction. This temporal orientation, this habitual residence in the immediate future, was the source of his greatness. Off the ice, in the slower, less structured environment of everyday life, that same orientation became a source of restlessness. Former teammates and close friends have described Gretzky in retirement as a man who always seemed to be looking for the next thing, the next project, the next challenge that might engage his mind the way hockey once did. He invested in businesses. He lent his name to ventures. He participated in charitable endeavors with genuine enthusiasm. He appeared at events and accepted honors and gave speeches and did the things that famous retired athletes do. But nothing quite captured him the way hockey had. Nothing demanded the totality of his attention and his cognitive gifts the way a game in progress had demanded them. The restlessness was not dissatisfaction with his life, which by every external measure was comfortable, privileged, and surrounded by people who loved him. It was the specific disquiet of a mind built for high-speed pattern recognition that no longer had patterns to recognize at the speed it was designed to process. This experience connects to a broader truth about the relationship between human beings and their deepest talents. We are not merely people who happen to possess certain abilities. We are, in a profound psychological sense, shaped by those abilities, organized around them, defined by them in ways that go beyond profession or career into the territory of identity. Wayne Gretzky was not a man who played hockey. He was a hockey player in the deepest possible sense of the term, a person whose identity, whose sense of self, whose understanding of his own place in the world was inseparable from the activity that had consumed him since Walter first flooded the backyard in Brantford. When that activity ended, something essential was lost. Not merely a career, but a mode of being, a way of engaging with the world that nothing else could replicate. The retirement was chosen freely and timed with dignity, but the loss it represented was real and permanent. The greatest hockey player who ever lived stepped off the ice at Madison Square Garden on that April afternoon in 1999 and entered a world where his greatest gifts had no application, where the cognitive machinery that had made him superhuman on the ice was merely ordinary everywhere else. That is the deeper truth of Wayne Gretzky's story. Not that he was the greatest. That fact is beyond debate. The deeper truth is that being the greatest at one thing does not prepare you for anything else, and that the transition from extraordinary to ordinary, from the ice to the rest of life, is a passage that even the great one could not navigate without loss. And yet, even in acknowledging that loss, there is something to admire in the way Gretzky has carried himself through it. He has not become bitter. He has not retreated from public life or lashed out at the world that moved on without him. He has remained gracious, available, generous with his time and his memories, willing to share the story of his career with anyone who asks, with a patience that reflects the essential kindness that has always been at the core of his character. The boy from Brantford who was chased from his hometown by jealousy grew into a man who refused to let disappointment or loss diminish his fundamental decency. That, in the end, may be the most remarkable thing about Wayne Gretzky. Not the records, not the championships, not the cultural transformation. The fact that he remained, through all of it, a genuinely good human being. In the years since Wayne Gretzky played his final game on that April afternoon in 1999, the sport of hockey has continued to evolve in ways that both honour and challenge his legacy. The NHL has grown to 32 teams spread across North America, from the traditional hockey heartland of Canada and the northern United States to the Sunbelt markets that Gretzky's move to Los Angeles helped create and legitimize. Television contracts have expanded significantly in both scope and value, bringing the sport into homes that would have been utterly unreachable during Gretzky's playing years. Youth hockey participation has grown in communities that had never seen a frozen pond, communities in Arizona and Texas and Florida and North Carolina, where children now dream of playing in the NHL because their parents or grandparents watched Wayne Gretzky on television decades earlier and fell in love with a sport they had never known existed. The international composition of the league has broadened beyond what previous generations could have imagined or would have welcomed. Players from Russia, Sweden, Finland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Germany, Switzerland, Latvia, Denmark, and a growing list of other nations now comprise a substantial and essential portion of every roster in the league. The game has become truly global in its talent base and its audience, and while many factors contributed to that globalization, including the fall of the Soviet Union, the growth of European hockey leagues, and the deliberate recruitment efforts of NHL teams, the cultural shift that Gretzky catalyzed by making hockey visible in the broader American consciousness cannot be separated from the story. He opened a door, and the world walked through it. The game itself is faster, more athletic, and more tactically sophisticated than it was during Gretzky's prime, a fact that invites comparison while simultaneously making comparison impossible. Players today are bigger, stronger, and better conditioned than their predecessors. They arrive in the NHL having trained from childhood with sports science methods, nutritional programs, and video analysis tools that did not exist in the 1980s. Goaltending equipment has evolved from the modest pads and gloves of Gretzky's era to precisely engineered armour that covers far more of the net and moves with the goaltender rather than against him. Defense systems employ zone coverage, active stick positioning, and coordinated shot blocking strategies that make scoring dramatically more difficult than it was during the high-flying 80s. Advanced analytics have transformed the way players are evaluated, replacing simple counting statistics like goals and assists with complex metrics measuring shot quality, zone entries, expected goals, and defensive contributions that were invisible to earlier generations of observers. The modern NHL is, in many tangible and measurable ways, a different sport from the one Gretzky played. And yet, at the center of it all, beneath the new technology and the new tactics and the new metrics, the fundamental essence remains what it has always been: a test of skill, intelligence, speed, and courage played on frozen water by human beings, pushing themselves to the limits of their ability. The essence endures. It is timeless. What has changed is the standard against which every generation of players is measured. That standard was established by Wayne Gretzky, and it has not been approached, let alone exceeded, by anyone who has followed him. Connor McDavid of the Edmonton Oilers is the player most frequently and most plausibly compared to Gretzky in the current era. McDavid is widely regarded as the best player in the world, a consensus that has held for the better part of a decade. He combines blazing, almost incomprehensible skating speed with exceptional creativity, vision, and stick-handling ability. He has won multiple Hart Trophies as scoring champion and multiple Hart Trophies as most valuable player. He has carried the Oilers deep into the playoffs with individual performances that inspire the inevitable comparisons to Gretzky's best years. But even McDavid at his absolute peak, performing at a level that no other current player can match, does not approach the statistical dominance that Gretzky achieved season after season for more than a decade. The gap is not a criticism of McDavid, who is a transcendent talent in his own right. It is a testament to the impossibility of what Gretzky accomplished in a different era under different conditions. McDavid is the best player of his generation. Gretzky was the best player of all generations. There is a philosophical dimension to Gretzky's legacy that transcends sport and speaks to something fundamental about human potential. He demonstrated, in the most public and measurable way possible, that physical limitations could be overcome by cognitive superiority. In a culture that worships measurable physical attributes, that drafts athletes based on how fast they can run, and how much they can lift, and how tall they stand in bare feet, Gretzky proved that the most important organ for an athlete is not the heart or the lungs or the muscles. It is the brain. His career was an argument delivered across 20 years and 2,857 points against the tyranny of physical measurement. It was a rebuke to every scouting system that told him he was too small, too slow, too frail. He did not merely survive despite those assessments. He rendered them permanently, comprehensively, magnificently irrelevant. The rituals and symbols surrounding his legacy reflect the sport's recognition of what he meant and continues to mean. The league-wide retirement of number 99 remains unique in the NHL and virtually without precedent in any major North American professional sport. His induction into the Hockey Hall of Fame was immediate. The customary waiting period waived in recognition that no waiting was necessary or appropriate. The Wayne Gretzky Award is given annually. Statues stand outside arenas where he played, bronze figures frozen in the act of skating or shooting or celebrating, permanent installations in civic space that declare through their mere existence that this man mattered beyond the boundaries of sport. His records are woven into the fabric of the game at every level, cited in broadcasts, printed in programs, discussed in conversations between fathers and sons, the way earlier generations discussed the records of Gordie Howe and Maurice Richard. But perhaps the most enduring and most important element of Gretzky's legacy is the simplest one, the one that requires no statistics or records or institutional recognition to understand. Wayne Gretzky made people love hockey. He made them watch a sport they had never watched before. He made them care about a game played in cold arenas in distant cities by players whose names they had never heard. He did it not through controversy or scandal or the manufactured spectacle that drives attention in the modern media landscape. He did it through the quiet, relentless, night after night expression of a gift that no one before or since has possessed in equal measure. He played the game the way it was meant to be played, with intelligence and creativity and respect for the traditions and the people who had shaped the sport before he arrived. He honored the past while transforming the future. He was, in every meaningful and lasting sense that matters, the greatest one. So what remains when the final goal has been scored, when the last assist has been recorded in the official books, when the skates are unlaced for the last time and hung in a closet rather than a locker, when the arena lights dim to darkness and the crowd files out into the night and the Zamboni makes its final pass across the empty ice? What remains is the memory of a man who saw the game differently than anyone who came before him or after him, who moved across the frozen surface with a purpose that transcended statistics and trophies and championships, who made the sport of hockey beautiful in a way it had not been beautiful before and may not be beautiful again. Wayne Gretzky's career was not merely a collection of records, though the records alone would secure his place in history for as long as the sport of hockey exists in any recognizable form. It was a sustained act of creative expression performed under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Every game was played on a sheet of ice 200 feet long and 85 feet wide, surrounded by opponents whose sole purpose was to stop him, in front of crowds who expected brilliance as a baseline rather than a bonus. Under the accumulated weight of expectations that grew heavier and more suffocating with every passing season, he delivered, not occasionally, not in bursts of inspiration followed by periods of normalcy. He delivered with a consistency that has no parallel in professional team sports. Night after night, season after season, decade after decade, from his debut as a teenaged prodigy in the World Hockey Association to his farewell lap at Madison Square Garden, he gave the sport everything he had, and what he had was more than anyone else has ever possessed. He was the boy who scored 378 goals in a single season of youth hockey before he was old enough to understand what the adults in the stands were shouting at him and about him. He was the teenager who left his hometown because the jealousy of grown men and women had made his life unbearable, who learned at 14 that talent does not protect you from the cruelty of small-minded people. He was the young man who arrived in the National Hockey League to the sound of skeptics explaining in confident detail why he could not possibly succeed, and who answered with 137 points in his first season and 212 in his third. He was the captain who lifted the Stanley Cup 4 times, who built a dynasty from nothing in a northern Alberta city, who wept when he was traded from the franchise and the community he loved, who carried an entire sport on his narrow, allegedly too-fresh shoulders to places it had never been and might never have reached without him. He was the aging star who played through chronic back pain that would have driven lesser competitors into early retirement, who adapted his game with remarkable intelligence as his body declined, who refused to diminish his effort or his preparation even as the results fell below the impossible standards he had established in his extraordinary youth. He was the man who circled the ice at Madison Square Garden one final time while 18,000 people stood and applauded and wept, knowing they were witnessing the end of something irreplaceable, something that could not be manufactured or repeated or approximated by anyone who followed. He was Wayne Gretzky, number 99, the Great One. The title was not given lightly, and it was not given prematurely. It was earned across 2,857 points, 61 records, 4 Stanley Cup championships, and a career that stretched from a backyard rink in Brantford, Ontario, to the bright lights of Broadway. It was earned through sacrifice and brilliance, through pain and persistence, through heartbreak and triumph, through the quiet, relentless accumulation of moments that compose the most extraordinary individual career in the history of team sports. Those who say the game has moved beyond Wayne Gretzky are wrong, and they are wrong in a way that reveals a misunderstanding of what made him great. The game has moved forward, as all games do, driven by advances in training, nutrition, equipment, and tactical understanding. But it has not moved beyond what Gretzky represented, because what Gretzky represented cannot be made obsolete by progress. Intelligence does not become outdated. Vision does not expire. The ability to see a pass that no one else on the ice can see, to anticipate movement before it begins, to find pattern and meaning and opportunity within the chaos of 10 bodies moving at high speed on a frozen surface. These are timeless qualities. They belong to the essence of the sport before Gretzky arrived, existing in embryonic form in the play of every great center who preceded him. He perfected them. He showed the world what was possible when those qualities reached their purest, most fully realized expression. And the demonstration changed the sport forever. The backyard rink in Brantford is gone now. The ice has melted for the last time. The pylons that Walter set out with such care are stored away or discarded. The neighborhood has changed. The house remains, but the boy does not. He grew up. He became the greatest hockey player who ever lived. He gave the sport more than it had any right to ask of one person, and he gave it with a generosity of spirit that matched the generosity of his passing on the ice. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in April of 1999, he stepped off the ice and into the rest of his life, carrying with him everything he had accomplished and everything he had lost along the way. The records will stand. They will stand for decades, perhaps for centuries, perhaps forever. The championships will be remembered and celebrated and debated by generations who never saw him play, but who will know his name because some names outlast the lifetimes that produced them. The number 99 will hang in every arena in the National Hockey League for as long as the league exists, a permanent, indelible reminder that once, for a brief and beautiful span of time measured in seasons rather than centuries, one man played this cold, hard, beautiful game better than anyone had ever played it before, better perhaps than anyone will ever play it again. And if you listen closely, on the quietest winter nights, when the wind blows across the frozen ponds of Ontario and the stars burn cold and bright above the empty rinks, and the world is still enough to hear the smallest sounds, you can almost hear the whisper of a boy's skates on backyard ice, cutting figures in the darkness, chasing a puck toward a place that no one else can see, moving not to where it is, but to where it is going to be. That sound is the legacy of Wayne Gretzky. It will echo as long as the game is played. It will echo as long as there is ice. It will echo forever.